All right, just a quick video for chapter 6 in nonverbal communication. And this video talks about defining what nonverbal communication is. So what is nonverbal communication and how would you define it? Well, if you look at the variety of definitions, this one comes from the textbook, but a lot of them are fairly consistent with this definition that's offered in the book. The definition in the book tends to be a little more functional in nature. In other words, it tells you about the functions of nonverbal communication. And that definition is that nonverbal communication consists of relaying message units to augment, contradict, or replace verbal communication. So this presents to you three different ways that we use nonverbal communication. One is to augment or supplement the verbal communication, right? So it's something that accompanies the verbal communication. If we have a message we're stating, then it is something that goes along to reinforce that verbal message. Or we might use nonverbal communication to contradict what we are saying. So at times, for example, sarcasm is one thing when it comes to paralanguage, in which the tone of voice contradicts the verbal message. Someone in class would ask me, Mr. Sheffield, would you loan me 20 bucks? And I'd say, oh, sure, I'll loan you $20, right? And the tone of the voice contradicts the verbal message. Or we use it to replace verbal communication, right? How you doing? Right? I'm doing good. Right? We don't say that, we just give them a thumbs up or okay, right? And so we use it to replace verbal communication a lot of times. Now, depending on the definition, you have anywhere from 75 to 90%, 95% of all communication that's nonverbal. Now, you might wonder why that's so high, right? It's going to be high if you only think of it as something that we do while we're engaged in like replacing verbal communication. But if we don't think about the fact that we use it a lot when we're actually supplementing or augmenting verbal communication, then it might not seem that high, right? So if we think about it as all of these three sorts of functions, that percentage of nonverbal communication use is really in that 75 to 95% of time. Also, in defining nonverbal communication, I want to mention the fact that meaning in nonverbal communication is similar to verbal communication. In verbal communication, we talked about the meaning being in people, not in the words themselves, right? Because if it was in the words themselves, we'd have one meaning, everybody would understand, we'd be fine. But in verbal communication, we know that a term that might mean something to one person might mean something different to another person, even if it's the same word, because we have different experiences. So we engage in decoding that information. We have to apply it to what it means to us, right? So one of the activities that I do with language, and I may have mentioned this when we talked about language, but one of the things I have people do in class is when we do verbal communication is I say, take out a sheet of paper and draw a tree. Right? Don't look at your neighbors, don't share, don't discuss, just take a minute and draw a tree. So I give them a minute, they draw a tree, and then I say, okay, now take your tree and show it to the neighbors around you and share that, right? So they all look at each other's trees and there's some giggling and laughing and things like that. And then I ask the question, do the trees all look the same? And I get, the closest thing we get is, well, it kind of looks similar, right? But the question is, does it look exactly the same? So no two trees in the whole class are exactly the same. Some people draw, oak trees or elm trees or whatever. Some people draw pine trees. Some people draw, gosh, I can't think of the name, but palm trees. Yeah, palm trees and pine trees. That's why I got confused, because they sound almost the same. But so the whole idea is that people interpret it the way that they're used to seeing a tree, right? So it could be something that we had a student in class. We did this in one of my face-to-face classes earlier, and they said, well, this is, I grew up in California and there's lots of palm trees. So this is something they're used to. If you didn't grow up in California and you were around a bunch of palm trees, you're probably not going to think of drawing a palm tree. You might draw the tree that in the front yard of the house you grew up in. And so again, the meaning of the message lies in the nonverbal symbol or cue, and not lies in the person and not in the nonverbal symbol or cue. Otherwise, again, those trees that people drew would have all been exactly the same, right? And so you still have the same thing with nonverbal communication that you have in verbal communication. And you have rules, like pragmatic rules, that govern how we use nonverbal cues, right? In what situations do we use them and how are they interpreted by people, or what should they mean? We have some general consensus about what this means to people. In American culture, I'll tie this back to our discussion of culture, but if you go to Brazil and you do something like that, right, it's an insult, or the okay sign, which we interpret as being, hey, I'm okay, right, everything's good. In other countries, it takes on a different meaning. So we tie that back into the nonverbal discussion we had earlier in the semester. But again, pragmatic rules will affect the way that we understand and use nonverbal cues. Okay, so this is a little bit about understanding what nonverbal communication is, definition-wise, and also how often we use nonverbal communication. It's way higher than most of you probably imagined, and so it begs to be analyzed, and it begs to for us to understand what nonverbal communication is.